Hello, welcome to the Daily Politics. Change is in the air, says Theresa May, as she warns businesses they have to behave responsibly if they want the government's support. She's been addressing business leaders at the CBI's annual conference this morning, but has she already backed away from controversial plans to put workers on company boards? Jeremy Corbyn accuses the government of fanning the flames of fear over immigration and says he won't make false promises. But will his own policy win over the voters? There's been a surprise result as French voters choose the centre-right candidate for presidential elections next year. So is this man on course to win? And what does it mean for Europe and the UK? And Donald Trump thinks Scotland's a special place. Not just because he owns a golf course there. We'll be talking about the Scottish roots of the president-elect. All that in the next hour, and with us for the whole of the programme today, it's the Conservative MEP Daniel Hannan. He's been described as the man who brought you Brexit. And the Labour MP Cat Smith. She only entered Parliament last year, but she's already joined Jeremy Corbyn's top team as Shadow Minister for Voter Engagement and Youth Affairs. Welcome to both of you. First of all today, let's turn to France, where ex-President Nicolas Sarkozy has been knocked out of a primary to choose the presidential candidate of the centre-right Republican Party. The surprise result has put François Fillon, who served as Mr Sarkozy's Prime Minister, in pole position to win when the contest closes next Sunday. He faces Alain Juppé, another ex-Prime Minister, who finished second. The winner will compete in next year's presidential election, and if the polls are to be believed, they are likely to end up competing for France's top job against far-right leader Marine Le Pen. Well, to find out more, we're joined by our correspondent Gavin Lee, who is in Brussels. Gavin, how much of an upset was this?
Well, it was supposed to be for many in Nicolas Sarkozy's circle, the revenant of the former president. In exile for many years, some people thought he would never come back. And he had given reasons, Nicolas Sarkozy, for why, for example, that he didn't appear prominent again in politics after he served as president during the time of the global financial crisis. Well, his point that he was making was, well, he was at a loss because of events he couldn't control. And then he tried to become president again in 2012, lost out. He said he didn't go as right-wing, as hard as he wanted to. So he went all out. And many would see some parallels with Nicolas Sarkozy, taking perhaps an approach of Marine Le Pen, also looking at Donald Trump as well. And he said things like he wanted to see the banning of the burqa on the beaches of France. He wanted to see the banning of the niqab in schools, that if you refused to eat pork, for example, that you wouldn't be able to have special school meals as children through school. So he had taken sort of what some would say, a particular nationalistic, populistic approach, and it hadn't worked. We've got these two men now, François Fillon, a former Prime Minister to Nicolas Sarkozy, who wants to make his own reforms, and Alain Juppé, the oldest politician in the contest at 71, also a former Prime Minister.
What about the 5 referendums that have been suggested? What are they?
Well, this is something that François Fillon wants to see. That he said he wants anything from a referendum when it comes to immigration, when it comes to the domestic issues like the budget, for example. And he's also questioned the idea of the Le Touquet agreement with the UK, the current situation when it comes to Calais and the border police, the British border police being on the French side. So these are some of the very different reforms, as you say, the 5 referendums he wants to see. And he's notable, François Fillon, as well, because he takes a far more pro-Russian stance than any of the other EU leaders. He recently criticised NATO for saying that it was meddling and actually exacerbating the problem with Russia. So I think he will be a different face, and a face that many would see, if he were to make it through as president, as perhaps unpredictable on that front as Donald Trump. And he's somebody who, with links to the UK, has been called a Thatcherite, somebody who wants to see liberal reform, wants to drastically cut the civil service. He wants to reduce what he sees as the inflexibility of the French working weeks, to make overtime possible, the talk of working on a Sundays as well. So there's quite a lot of changes he wants to make, whereas who he's up against next Sunday, the runoff for their party in the presidential debate, is going to be Alain Juppé, seen as far more safe pair of hands, but perhaps some would say that's his curse as well.
Gavin Lee in Brussels, thank you very much. Dan Hannan, do you welcome the fact that François Fillon topped that poll and could face Marine Le Pen rather than Alain Juppé?
I do, yes. I think he'll be exactly what France needs. He's a reformer. I mean, the central fact of France is that the French state has not had a balanced budget since 1974. And up until now, no one has really tried to tackle that. Some people get in saying they will, but no one does. You know, we have an immediate interest in the prosperity of France. They're our friends and our allies. And of course, prosperous neighbours make good customers. So I'm cautiously optimistic. And you could say the system's worked, that an open primary threw up exactly the result that was needed.
Right. I mean, do you think he can beat Marine Le Pen?
I hope so. And because, of course, Marine Le Pen has set her face against any reforms, quite apart from what she says about migration and so on. She's also well to the left of the socialists when it comes to economics. She wants higher pensions and higher social security spending and so on. And we are separated by a short stretch of water. France in economic collapse is bound to be bad for us, whereas France recovering is good for us.
Cat Smith, on Brexit, François Fillon has called for a quick divorce. Do you think that would be good for the UK in the negotiations?
I think that it would be better to have a full 2-year negotiation. I don't think a quick divorce, to use the quote, would be necessarily the advantage of the UK. But I think what's been thrown up in these French elections is that this is the time to not be an establishment candidate. I think that the voters across Western Europe are looking for outsiders and people that are perceived to not be part of that political class. So whoever is selected in this primary, I think, has a real fight on their hands.
You think Marine Le Pen's got a good chance of winning if she's in the final runoff?
I'm afraid that I think she has a very good chance and that we need the strongest candidate possible, because I don't think she's good news at all for Europe.
Who would be the strongest candidate possible?
To be honest, I don't know, and I wouldn't like to back any candidate in this. I think that's for the French to decide.
Because at the moment the socialists don't seem to be in terms of actually...
They've withdrawn from the field, but the fact that Fillon just got this massive vote in a primary, he won pretty much every major region of metropolitan France, you know, suggests that he does have some appeal, and I think that's very encouraging.
Right.
Primaries have had a bit of a bad time since Donald Trump. It's nice to see them making a bit of a comeback.
But so have referendums, of course, if you are the person actually calling them. If we think of David Cameron particularly, he lost his own referendum. Do you think they're a really good idea to put the sort of referendums that Fillon is suggesting?
Yes, referendums
because they tend not to go the way of the people who call them. I'm not saying it's the right or the wrong way, but the people who call them, Nicola Sturgeon...
Referendums are always and everywhere a good idea. It's always better to trust people. I mean, in a way, you've just made the point. Occasionally, politicians don't get the answer that they want. Well, that's healthy. That's necessary in a system, so that otherwise we have an oligarchy where a tiny number of politicians get to decide everything. It's got to be right occasionally to invite people. By and large, countries that have referendums and make the most use of them do pretty well. Up at the top of the list is Switzerland. They seem to be doing all right.
Now, it's time for our daily quiz. And the question for today is what appears on the cushions in Donald Trump's New York apartment? Yes, we ask all the big important questions. Is it A, Hillary Clinton, B, the Trump coat of arms, C, the slogan, "You're fired," or D, an embroidered image of the Mexican border? At the end of the show, Kat and Dan will give us the correct answer, I'm sure. Now, it's the Confederation of British Industry's annual conference today in central London. And both Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn are on the billing. The Prime Minister set out her stall to business leaders this morning, and Jeremy Corbyn will appear in front of delegates later. While previous Conservative leaders have sought to reduce state intervention, Theresa May has made it clear she intends to, in her words, do things differently. So let's take a look at some of the business policies that have been rolling off the government's production line so far. Since taking the office of Prime Minister, Theresa May has talked about the need to promote responsible capitalism. Today, at the CBI, she offered business a grand bargain, proposing investment and tax cuts in exchange for help dealing with the worst excesses of capitalism. Mrs May said the government is offering an industrial strategy that will include an extra £2 billion a year by 2020 to support research and development. She also pledged to ensure that the corporation tax rate is the lowest in the G20. But in return, she said business also needs to change and that a small minority appear to game the system and work to a different set of rules. Her plans to reform capitalism include representing workers' views on company boards, although it's not clear how far she'll go, and giving shareholders a binding vote on executive pay. Meanwhile, the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, will say this afternoon that more state intervention is needed to unleash the potential of entrepreneurial Britain. He'll also expand on his plans for a national investment bank, which would see a Labour government borrow hundreds of billions of pounds to invest in long-term infrastructure projects. Well, let's have a listen to Mrs May speaking to business leaders this morning.
For if we support free markets, value capitalism and back business, and we do, we must do everything we can to keep faith with them. And with not enough people feeling that they share in the wealth created by capitalism, and with the recent behaviour of a small minority of businesses and business leaders undermining the reputation of the corporate world as a whole, the way to keep that faith is to embrace reform.
Well, that was Theresa May. We're joined now by the Director General of the CBI, Carolyn Fairbairn. Thank you for joining us on The Daily Politics. Theresa May says she's offering the business community a grand bargain. Is that good from your perspective?
Well, we hugely welcome today what is a really pro-enterprise speech that is setting out a vision for the UK which puts innovation and invention at the heart, is talking about the value of free markets. We really welcome that. And at the same time, yes, I mean, the Prime Minister is talking about a social contract. Businesses recognise that and are absolutely here to rise to the challenge of making that work.
Right, but an extra £2 billion a year by 2020 of investment in research and development, obviously you're going to welcome that. But is it really a grand bargain? I mean, the Labour Party is offering £500 billion over 10 years.
Well, I think that what she has set out this morning is actually something which is, she talks about an industrial strategy, which is about creating the enablers for a strong economy. She talked about productivity and raising productivity across the UK. And the innovation part is only part of that. The skills agenda, infrastructure, connecting our cities in the north and the south, these are all other parts of the picture, and we look forward to the autumn statement on Wednesday to see a little bit more of that plan.
Right, so you're happy with the £2 billion figure, although, as I say, not really starting till 2020. But a bargain is a bargain, it's two-way, and Theresa May has said that some businesses game the system and play to a different set of rules. Is that fair?
There are some businesses that are not playing straight, and I think it's up to all businesses to call that out, because it does affect and tarnish the reputation of the many. So this is something we welcome. I think it is an area where businesses can step up, take a lead, and reform in areas where we can prevent the actions of the few from tarnishing the reputation of the many.
Right, so which businesses in your mind are not being straight, if you like, to use her language?
Well, I'm not going to name names, but I have to say I think it was welcome in the Prime Minister's speech that she recognised it was the few, and that it is the majority are good citizens. They're investing in their communities. They are innovating. They are creating jobs. So it is a recognition of the few, and that's what we need to address. And the corporate governance green paper that she talked about is something that we welcome.
I think people might say it's easy to say that there are some businesses that don't play by the rules and they need to be called out. But if nobody's going to actually name who they are, or at least the areas in which the rules are not being adhered to, then do they actually exist? I mean, is this a sort of false bogeyman being put up here, unless either you or Theresa May are prepared to say who they are?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that we do have strong rule of law in this country. We do actually have very good corporate governance. It's recognised around the world as being very strong. But where that happened, I think it is an important thing to have the right mechanisms in place. And by and large, we know we really do. It's one of the areas, actually, I think the UK is seen globally as being strong. But there is more to do. We know that there are issues around trust and the reputation of business, and I think this is part of the progress towards fixing it. And therefore, we welcome it, and we'll be engaging very strongly on the government's proposals in the Green Paper.
Right. Now, there had been quite a lot of talk and rhetoric about forcing companies to have workers sitting on their boards. But it looks as if today Theresa May has rowed back from that. She's now saying the views of workers should be represented, which is not the same thing. Do you welcome that?
The initial proposals were actually about the representation of workers' voices and consumer voices on boards. It was never actually about putting a worker on a board, necessarily. And some companies do welcome that. We've spoken to many companies, and for some companies that is absolutely the right model. But it's not the only way. And I think we welcome the fact that the Prime Minister is going to set out a range of options, of which that will be one. Some companies will welcome that, but there are other ways of doing it. I think one of the things that's absolutely right is that where companies do engage really well with their employees, they are better, more productive companies, and that's what we need to be aiming to achieve here.
Right. I mean, I think the implication was that there was going to be a promise to put workers on company boards, and it sounds like you're pleased that there isn't going to be any element of compulsion, or that is going to be the only way to have workers' views represented.
I think the fact there's going to be a range of options is a really good idea.
Right. Let's talk about Brexit and the grand bargain, because if it becomes clearer than it is now that the UK is going to pull out of the single market and the customs union, then would you still welcome the grand bargain that Theresa May's put forward today?
Well, we have to wait and see on that. I mean, as you know, businesses would like more certainty, they'd like a plan. We understand why that's not possible at the moment. One of the things that we would like to see is transitional arrangements so that companies who are most affected have time to prepare. We have to see what happens. And one of the things that we welcome today from the Prime Minister is that she has said that when she can say something, she will. And that is, I think, what businesses need to know. And they need to know they're being listened to.
But when does that need to happen, do you think, Carolyn?
We want more. Well, we are looking over the next few months. We're going to be triggering Article 50 by the end of March. That is still the timetable that the government is setting out. And we look forward to when they have something to say. We look forward to hearing that really soon, because the uncertainty is affecting investment, and it is going to be important for there to be a plan quickly.
Right. Every indication has shown that they are favouring pulling out of the single market, that in a way they don't see UK leaving the EU, unless we pull out of the single market and also the customs union. How worried would you be by that?
Well, language is important here. We talk about barrier-free access to the single market. That's what really matters for businesses, that they can trade without tariffs, without non-tariff barriers around regulation. That's the really important principle there. And we want that to be set out as being a very strong priority. The customs union is a more complicated issue. That is a trade-off, really, between, we would like to be able to do new free trade deals around the world with India, China, US, for example, but the implications for red tape at borders is significant for some businesses. So these are complicated issues, and I think, again, what we're saying to government there is listen to business, consult with business. You'll hear different views, you'll hear the evidence.
Carolyn, Fairbairn, thank you very much. Dan Hannan, Theresa May has rowed back on her plans to have workers on company boards. She's only offering £2 billion. It sounds like a lot, but it's still, compared to what Labour is offering, £2 billion of research and development money by 2020. Do you think this is a rather paltry offering?
No, I think she's saying all the right things. We have a basically protectionist European Commission. We now have a basically protectionist White House. Somebody needs to be out there making the case for free trade, free markets, free competition. Not for the first time. That's going to be the United Kingdom. But she's right to say that the climate in which to make that case is not a particularly friendly one. Extraordinary thing about our age, that there's never been a better time to be a human being. Extreme poverty has fallen since 1990 from 38% to 8%. Why? Because African and Asian countries have joined the global market system. And yet, all these idealistic young people are picketing G7 meetings and occupying Wall Street. So she needs to make the argument in a way that shows that free trade is not about benefiting big corporates. It's about poverty alleviation, it's about social justice, and it's about conflict resolution.
Right, but a lot of people think exactly the opposite. They actually think they've been left behind by free trade and globalisation,
weird,
and hence, well, it may be weird, but it's the reality, isn't it? I mean, Cat Smith, on that basis, where do you stand in terms of this industrial policy that Jeremy Corbyn has talked about, £500 billion? How would it work exactly?
Well, it's clear that we do need to listen to business, and if we listen to what Carolyn Fairbairn was saying there, I think there's a sense of uncertainty coming from business at the moment. And whilst Theresa May says all the right things around people feeling very left behind by globalisation, it needs to be followed through with action. We need to ensure that actually the gap between the very richest and the very poorest is not continuing to expand in the way that it is. And Dan's absolutely right to say that when it comes to lifting people out of extreme poverty, that has happened. But when people see at the other end, people getting richer and richer and richer, they can feel like that it very much is the haves and the have-nots. And I think at the moment that's the kind of society we're living in. Some people just do not feel they have any opportunities.
All right, well, let's
fair crack at the whip.
If they don't have any opportunity, or they don't feel they have any opportunities, would putting workers on company boards make them feel better?
I think that the best businesses that I know in my constituency are the ones that have that good relationship with the workforce.
Right, good relationship's one thing, but what about putting a worker on a company board?
A worker on a company board ensures that the voice of the workforce is heard in those important decisions in the direction of the company, and I support it.
Right, but she's rode back from it. Was that a mistake?
No, I mean
actually that is what she promised initially, and
there should be a basic kind of presumption of innocence here. Companies want to be successful. They don't need to be told through legislation to be successful.
But then why is the difference between what execs are paid and what those employees are paid is so huge?
Right, and I think there is a case for tweaking the corporate government rules, basically to encourage shareholders to think of themselves and behave like proprietors rather than like investors. And with a couple of quite minor changes, some of which we were hearing from the business secretary, like allowing shareholders to vote definitively on executive pay. This isn't corporatism. This isn't the state taking over companies and telling them what to do. But a couple of improvements in the law, I think, will yield huge dividends.
Right. You heard what she had to say, Dan Hannan, about Carolyn Fairbairn, this is, about Brexit and how worried they are about tariff-free access to the single market. You obviously think it could be, sunny uplands if we come out of the single market and the customs union, but the business community doesn't agree with you. Not all businesses, but a lot of business community doesn't agree with it, and they have a right to disagree.
Well, I'm not sure that was what Carolyn was saying. She said she specifically, on the customs union, looked forward to being able to do trade deals with the US.
She said it was complicated.
Right, of course it's complicated, but still, the ability to do free trade agreements with the biggest economy in the world, the US, and the second biggest economy, China, I think that's a pretty big gain. When we look at how the world is moving, all the growth this century is outside the EU, we should definitely be free to do our own trade deals. Now, she's right, though, that we want access to the single market.
Tariff-free access.
Anyone,
not access, tariff-free. Anyone can have access, but tariff-free access.
Tariff-free access. And I don't hear any voices from any serious politician on either side of the channel proposing tariffs. So I don't know why we're spending so much time fretting about something that literally no one is suggesting.
Well, partly because, of course, they say, in the European countries that they don't know what the country actually wants until they've heard from Theresa May. Let's talk about Jeremy Corbyn's speech. He will outline the plans for the £500 billion of investment. Of course, that is a massive amount of borrowing. So Labour would be maxing out on the nation's credit card again.
Well, a huge number of economists say that now is the best time to borrow. Borrowing's never been so cheap. But then
it's been low for a long time in terms of borrowing.
And I think that there is a case that if we don't invest in our economy, then we can't grow it. And you can't just. Austerity has failed. We've had 6 wasted years under this government, whereby actually, for the vast majority of people, their wages have been held low, productivity is stagnating, and we're not seeing any massive improvements. So actually, we do need to look at alternative ways.
We had more jobs created in this country than the whole of the EU put together over that period.
Right, but do you agree productivity levels have been low? Productivity levels have been low in this country for a long time. There has been wage stagnation. It's gone up a little bit now, but people are predicting it might go down. So, yes, how do you answer Kat's allegations?
Well, given where we were starting from, given that we were squeezing out that debt, I think we did pretty darned well compared to every other industrialised country in the world. And I'm very bullish that it's going to carry on. I think we're very well equipped for the 20th century. We're a live, agile economy. I see a great future for us doing driverless cars and biotech and 3D printing. We're a very inventive people.
Although Kat's been talking about the last 6 years, I suppose not the future. But anyway, over the weekend, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn again rejected calls by some in his party to pledge to cut immigration, saying he wouldn't make false promises like the Conservatives. Instead, he favours measures to mitigate the impact of migration. Here he is talking to his party's National Policy Forum in Loughborough.
Politicians and political parties have a choice in this age of understandable cynicism. Do we play on people's fears and anxieties, or do we take what might be the more difficult approach to restore hope? We can see the choice being taken by politicians on the hard right to whip up division against migrants, Muslims, Mexicans, women, LGBT people, people with disabilities. The fake anti-elitism of rich white men like Nigel Farage and Donald Trump is farcical at one level, but in reality, it's no joke at all.
Jeremy Corbyn speaking on Saturday. So is the party's position on immigration and freedom of movement now resolved? Well, perhaps not entirely. The shadow Brexit Secretary Keir Starmer has said immigration is too high. But last week, Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott warned against trying to out-UKIP on the issue. She said the idea that Labour was losing voters to the Tories or UKIP because of immigration was false. Well, to talk about this, we're joined by the Labour MP Ian Austin, and he joins us from Birmingham. So, Ian Austin, take that on board. Are you losing voters to the Tories and UKIP because of immigration?
Well, I think for a long time, people in large parts of the country, in particular parts of the Midlands, areas like the Black Country that I represent, think that London-based politicians haven't been prepared to listen to their concerns on immigration. And I think we heard, Diane last week presenting this false choice that to listen to local people on immigration, to try and come up with fair and reasonable answers to their concerns, is in some way trying to out-UKIP. And I just think nothing could be further from the truth. I think we've got to listen to local people, we've got to listen to their concerns, and we've got to do the hard work of coming up with fair and reasonable answers that are in line with our values. And that's totally different from the approach that UKIP take to this.
Right. I mean, Cat Smith, does Jeremy Corbyn understand the deep, widespread and legitimate concerns of many Labour voters about levels of immigration?
Well, I think that Jeremy listens to Labour MPs from up and down the country, and I hear what Ian's comments were, and I recognise that what my constituents are telling me are probably the same things that Ian's hearing from his constituents. People are worried about immigration, and people are concerned about their wages being undercut and strains on public services. And I think that we do need to start talking about immigration in a really open and honest way. The reality is that without levels of immigration, you can't have public services and the NHS functioning. So we need to be honest with people and say there needs to be immigration, but we need to make sure that the consequences on communities are not that they can't get a school place or that their waiting lists at hospitals or GP surgeries are unacceptably long.
Right.
And actually this is as much about investing in public services as it is about immigration.
Right. Do you think, Ian Austin, that the Labour Party has done enough to mitigate some of the effects and impacts of immigration on communities like yours?
Well, clearly we haven't, have we? I think we should be taking the benefits that well-paid migrants bring to the economy, city traders, hedge fund dealers and all the rest of it in the City of London, and we should be using the taxes they pay to relieve the pressure that low-paid migration can cause to the NHS and schools in areas like the Black Country. But I think we should go further. I think we should insist, for example, that every time a large company has to take on a skilled foreign worker from abroad because they can't find the skills they need in this country, they should have to take on an apprentice as well. I think we should do much more to deport foreign criminals and prevent people who've committed serious crimes abroad from coming here in the first place. We should bring back fingerprinting for illegal immigrants at Calais, which was abolished by this government. We should do much more on the border force, which again was cut by this government. And I think that we should say, people shouldn't be able to come here and be unemployed. They shouldn't be able to come here and claim benefits until they've worked and paid into the system. And they shouldn't be able to claim benefits for children that aren't in the country. So I think there are lots of things that we can do that are based on our values of hard work, responsibility and contribution that are a million miles away from what UKIP says. And when people like Diane present this false choice of, if you're daring to listen to local people on immigration, you're somehow aping the far right. I think it's just offensive nonsense.
Right. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, through his spokesman, believes that it's not about the numbers. He doesn't think that people are concerned, and he certainly isn't, about the numbers of immigrants coming to the UK. Is he wrong?
Well, I think that, well, look, clearly, I mean, look at what happened with the A8 countries. Clearly, the government at the time estimated the numbers completely wrongly, and that had different effects in different parts of the country. And I think politicians based in London need to get out of London and need to come to areas like the Black Country, and they need to listen to ordinary people's concerns. These people are not racist. They're not somehow beyond the pale. They've got perfectly legitimate concerns. And it's about time that politicians started listening to them and responding to them.
I mean, isn't that a problem you accept? Diane Abbott, Jeremy Corbyn, they are London-based MPs who have a very different view of the world to constituencies in other parts of the country, and therefore don't understand or appreciate the level of concern that Ian Austin has outlined. Do you want to see lower levels of immigration to the UK?
So regarding about London, I think that immigration does play out differently in different parts of the country, but I also don't think there's anything that Ian is saying, which is not incompatible, vast majority is not incompatible with where Jeremy
it's the
Corbyn
opposite of what Diane Abbott's saying.
I think there's a lot of common ground. I think that there is
hang on,
acknowledgement.
she's saying you can't UKIP on this issue, and Ian Austin is saying it's nothing to do with trying to out UKIP. So do you want to see lower levels of immigration, like Keir Starmer and Ian Austin have indicated, or do you agree with Jeremy Corbyn that it's not about the numbers?
Well, I won't be drawn on the numbers, but what I will say is I think that actually Ian and Jeremy probably have quite a lot of common ground on this, and I think that we're trying to create a row where
it's a very straightforward question, Kat Smith. Do you want to see lower levels of immigration, or do you want to see them about the same, or would you like to see more?
I think where immigration really benefits this country, it should be welcomed. And the fact is that people who are migrants in this country are more likely to put more into the economy than take out in welfare. And actually, it is migrants in this country who actually add to our chances of success as a country. And I won't be attacking anyone who is a migrant in this country, because the migrants in my community are the ones that contribute the most to my community. And but that's not to say that people do have concerns and fears. And I think that I've had it, from my constituents, and Ian's had it from his. And I think that is a problem that we need to address as a party, because for a very long time, I think we did try and dodge the issue about talking about immigration.
Right. Do you think now that a government of any colour would have to do something about the numbers of people coming to the UK, or can you do more, as Kat Smith and Ian Austin are saying, to actually address the impact and not focus on the numbers?
I think there is a feeling that immigration is out of control, and that people want to feel that we should be back in control of roughly who comes in and roughly in what numbers. But please don't make the mistake of attributing false motives to people. The people who have argued that, as Ian Austin correctly says, are not in the least bit racist or indecent. They want to have controlled legal immigration when it benefits the economy.
And lower?
Well, I think probably slightly lower than it's been recently, and you know what? I suspect that's going to happen anyway.
Right, but actually I think many voters would like it to be a lot lower.
There's a tiny number of people who want really, really drastic cuts. I just don't recognise that. There was a poll by British Future last month that said 88% of people want skilled workers to come here, 84% of people want all EU nationals who are already here, skilled or unskilled, to stay. So this is about being able to sift whom we allow in, to benefit from the energy and enterprise, and also, by the way, to be fair to non-EU immigrants, to people of Commonwealth backgrounds who also find that they're discriminated against by the current system.
Right. I mean, Ian Austin, Jeremy Corbyn is pretty clear. There'd be no targets or limits on immigration even after Brexit, as far as he is concerned, if he was in charge. Is he right on that?
Look, I think all the parties really need to wake up and listen to what people in places like the Black Country are saying about this. Politics would be simple, wouldn't it? If I could wander around saying, isn't the NHS great, aren't the Tories terrible, and handing out leaflets outside a Ken Loach film to people who already agree with us. But that's not what politics is like. And what we've got to do is listen to people's genuine and deeply held concerns, and then do the hard work of coming up with fair and reasonable answers to address them. And I think by dismissing this, or by saying we're not going to enter into a proper debate and we're not really going to focus on the concerns people have got, I tell you, that will be a disaster for Labour in this Parliament, just as it was in the last one.
Ian Austin, thank you. Now, all eyes will be on the House of Commons and Chancellor Philip Hammond as he delivers his first autumn statement on Wednesday. So let's take a look at that and the other political events likely to be making the news this week. When the Commons gets going this afternoon, MPs will be debating the Higher Education and Research Bill, and Labour will be attempting to make a number of amendments, including bringing back students' maintenance grants. On Tuesday, the Office for National Statistics publishes its latest set of data on the state of the UK's public finances. Wednesday sees Prime Minister's questions at noon. But the big event of the day is the autumn statement from Chancellor Philip Hammond. This is his first big set-piece statement in the Commons, and he said he wants to make the UK economy watertight to cope with the challenges ahead. The Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell will respond, and after the statement, the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility, the official economic watchdog, publishes its latest economic and fiscal outlook. Then on Thursday, it'll be the turn of the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies to give their take on Mr Hammond's work, a view which usually has a big impact on how the statement is seen. On Friday, the Women's Equality Party hold their first ever three-day conference, and that's in Manchester. Well, joining me now to discuss all of that are Laura Hughes from the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mirror's Ben Glaze. Welcome to both of you. What are you expecting from Philip Hammond, often known as Spreadsheet Phil?
Spreadsheet Phil. We know a bit about what's going to be coming up. So he's talked about infrastructure, putting £1.3 billion into developing roads and our transport systems in this country. We also know he's going to be introducing a ban on pension cold calling. There's going to be a crackdown on workers' perks, things like mobile phone contracts, gym membership, small things like that. There's also going to be a focus on jams, which the government are calling those who are just about managing. So we're going to see hopefully some tax cuts for those people, and we're also going to see a freeze on fuel duty and other things, I'm sure. But those are the main things I think we can be hoping to expect. Well,
that's fairly comprehensive there. I mean, Ben Glaze, let's look at the sort of future growth prospects, because it's also a big moment when we hear from the Office of Budget Responsibility, and it will give us a slightly clearer idea as to what is being expected in the years ahead.
That's right. We're expecting some pretty grave numbers from the OBR on Wednesday. So far, the forecasts that have come out haven't been official forecasts. This will be the first time we get to see the impact of Brexit on those public finances, on growth, and we can find out exactly how much a black hole is likely to be in the Treasury coffers after we leave the EU. Current projections are it might be about £100 billion that he's going to have to find. And those are extremely huge numbers for the Chancellor delivering his first autumn statement.
Now, Brexit will loom large. In fact, it will no doubt be a thread running through the whole autumn statement. He has talked about uncertainty in the past, bumps in the road. Perhaps they weren't his words. But in terms of the current economic data we have now, there doesn't seem to have been that much bad news coming the government's way.
No, we can see that there is some consumer confidence, but Philip Hammond was doing the rounds yesterday, and a lot of Tory MPs accused him of being overly pessimistic, you know. But is it right for the Chancellor to be cautious, or is he just a sort of half-empty kind of guy? I don't know. There are mixed figures, mixed numbers. Some people are saying this is great for exports, bad for imports. So some people are doing well, but others are not so sure. But he's really kind of emphasising that it's the uncertainty, what's going to happen in the future. He's really playing down expectations.
What about Labour's response? What will they focus on?
Well, Labour will call for the ESA cuts that are coming to be ameliorated. They also want the universal credit cuts that are coming down the line. They want those put back. But the problem for Philip Hammond is there isn't any money left. Labour wants a massive public spending, about £500 billion on infrastructure. John McDonnell has talked previously about £250 billion of investment, £100 billion for a National Investment Bank, another £150 billion generated from the private sector. Now, that would put money in, and then you get the economy growing again that way and generate some more cash for the Treasury. But the problem is there isn't that money available, and Philip Hammond's not going to have a lot to play with come Wednesday.
Although they always complain about that, don't they? What about stories in the papers, which they love, of course, the sort of prospect of Tony Blair returning to frontline politics, or not frontline maybe, but politics, in order to campaign against a hard Brexit? Dismissed by him, of course.
Yes, well, reportedly he is setting up an institute in Whitehall which will seek to influence the Brexit process. I spoke to a lot of Tory MPs yesterday, some Eurosceptics, who were delighted with the news that Tony Blair is coming back to argue everything that they don't want. They see him as a discredited establishment type figure, so they are very happy.
I heard that over the other side of the table.
I had one tweet on the day of the referendum, and it was a picture of Blair holding up the sign saying, "I voted Remain," and I just said, "He's voted, have you?" I hope he helped.
Oh, any truth in it?
Well, I think it'd be great for the Brexiteers if you've got a multi-millionaire, pro-European member of the global elite coming back to try and take control of the negotiations. It's just what the Brexiteers want.
Right. Well, on that note, thank you both very much. Now, as I said earlier, one of our guests today, Dan Hannan, has been described as the man who brought you Brexit. Indeed, former Northern Ireland Secretary Theresa Villiers said she texted him on the morning of the result to congratulate him on changing the course of European history. So if Theresa May says Brexit means Brexit, what does Dan say it means? Well, he's written a new book, I have it here, called What Next? All about, well, what next? He's also made a daily politics soapbox, and here it is.
So far, attention has focused disproportionately on our relationship with the Brussels institutions here and with the other 27 member states. Is it going to be a hard or a soft Brexit? Are we going to have access to the single market? But really, the answer to those questions was contained in the referendum result. A 52-48 vote is not an instruction to end all our institutional ties to the EU. It's an instruction to begin a phased and gradual repatriation of power. Having taken back control, in other words, having recovered our legal supremacy, there's no reason why we shouldn't replicate some of our existing arrangements through bilateral treaties with our European allies. In other words, a common market, not a common government. No one on either side of the Channel is seriously proposing tariffs or trade barriers. And in fact, every non-EU state in Europe, except Belarus, enjoys free trade with the European single market. Far more important is the question of our relations with the 165 countries that are not in the EU, the countries that will account for almost all of the world's economic growth this century. And here we have an opportunity to do something bold and beautiful. We can become, in the Prime Minister's phrase, the global leader in free trade. Genuinely unrestricted commerce, based on mutual product recognition rather than on the imposition of common standards, will do more to raise living standards in developing countries than decades of state aid. And instead of coming at a cost to British taxpayers, it'll bring benefit to British consumers. And the biggest benefits will be felt by the people on the lowest incomes, who stand to gain the most proportionately from cheaper prices. Back in charge of our own affairs, we can make Britain the best place in the region to do business. We can have lower, flatter, simpler taxes. We can have cheaper energy, lighter regulation, more affordable housing. We've spent 44 years in a dark and cramped room. Now the door swings open and we see a little rectangle of light. As our eyes adjust, we glimpse the colours of a summer meadow beyond. The swallows diving against the blue sky and the vivid green beech trees. Let's not hang around on the doorstep. Let's step out into the sunshine.
Well, that was Dan Hannan, and he's still here in the studio, and I'm sure he'll give us some more poetic lines in the next discussion. Do you accept, though, Dan Hannan, that there is still a lot of confusion around what the deal with the EU will be, because Vote Leave weren't clear themselves about what it would look like?
I mean, that's perfectly fair. Vote Leave went from the far left of the Labour Party through UKIP, trade unions, so of course there was a variety of opinions. And I think it's also unclear because a lot of people have got the idea that you're either in or out of the single market as though it's a single entity. And of course it isn't. The single market is an amalgam of lots of different things. Some bits of it are very attractive. For example, I think the real basis of the single market is the prohibition on discrimination against goods and products from another member state. I think we should keep that.
But let's stick to your idea that it's not a binary. Sorry, that it isn't a binary decision. Yeah. You say you can have other options, but actually for most people, you're either in as a member of the single market or you're not.
Well, you're not. That's just not true. It's a agglomeration over many years of lots of different responsibilities and obligations, some of which work for the benefit of the consumers, some of which bring down prices, we should keep those, some of which are very bad for us, for example, the common external tariff.
But that assumes that we will be able to pick and choose, and as we've heard from many foreign leaders, there isn't going to be a pick and mix or an a la carte menu. But in amongst this confusion that you have conceded existed because there are a whole different range of views, doesn't that mean that Parliament should have a say?
Oh, no one questions that Parliament is going to have the ultimate say. I mean, that was always
very
clear.
But a vote now, triggering Article 50...
Well, so they want another vote as well. Well, OK, fine. If that keeps everybody happy, let's do it.
Right, but as you say, it's not a binary decision in your mind. But let's have a listen to what you said regarding the single market on Channel 4 News last year.
To repeat, absolutely nobody is talking about threatening our place in the single market.
You said nobody was talking about that, but people were. And actually, to clear up for our viewers, this was put out by the group Open Europe. Do you think we should leave the single market, or don't you?
Well, I mean, you saw that filleted brilliantly by your colleague Andrew Neil yesterday. I mean, I'll say it one more time. There are aspects of the single market that I definitely think we should keep. We should, however, leave the customs union and we should leave the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Now, you say why should the other countries do that? Why should they just let us trade and not be part of all the other?
Well, because otherwise it sets a precedent to everybody else. Of course they're not going to do that.
We will all behave out of our rational self-interest.
And what makes you think that?
Well, because generally I find in diplomacy, decisions are made on the basis of present interest rather than past grudges or past gratitude. And just as it is in our interest to have prosperous neighbours who are good customers, so it is not in anyone's interest in Europe to have a trade war that would be disastrous for both sides.
But that means them giving us everything that you have just outlined. Now, you said that there wasn't any discussion about leaving the single market, but in fact you do want to leave parts of it. You just want everyone to accept the vision that you have for the single market. If we were to be like Norway, which I think at times you also thought was a good model, then we'd have to also accept the rules of the EU, freedom of movement and contribution to the EU budget.
So I have made it clear all the way through the campaign, including if you watch the full clip there rather than just 2 words of it, Norway, although definitely preferable to what we're doing now as a full member, is not nearly as good as what Switzerland is doing outside the EEA, and we should aim to do something better yet. But the broad model of it should be something closer to what the Swiss are doing, rather than to what the Norwegians are doing. I'm definitely not in favour of joining the European Economic Area. I am very much open to the idea of joining EFTA. EFTA, by the way, has free trade deals all over the world,
sure,
including with
But would that include some form of freedom of movement?
So, obviously, we're going to have to find a compromise.
Right.
Because, as I said earlier, no one is talking about screwing the tap completely shut. For example, simply going back to the old rule that you had to have a job to come to, that wouldn't just be symbolic. 70,000 EU nationals came looking for work to the UK last year. That would be a really major impact on migration. And it would allow us to make more of a distinction over the kinds of people we're letting in and the kinds of people that we don't want.
Cat Smith, do you agree with Dan Hannan that European leaders will give us what we want, that we will be able to have our cake and eat it, to use the Boris Johnson phrase, that we'll be able to pick some parts of the single market that we'd like to keep and junk the others?
I really like Dan's optimism, but I think that with, in the world of reality, I think that there will be a move in Europe to punish us for the decision that we have made to leave, because they don't want to send out the message that you can leave the European Union and still keep all the bits that you like and get rid of all the bits you don't like. And I do worry that we will be punished for the decision that we made.
In which case it's a protection racket. In which case, thank heaven we're leaving. If it's held together by fear, it's not a club, it's a racket.
Right, but that means we'll also have to leave the bits that you think are positive. So you accept that the price would be worth paying to completely leave the single market.
I have a much higher opinion of our
excess.
European allies than Cat does.
Right,
I think they will behave out of their own self-interest. I'm not expecting them to do us any favours.
Well, OK, let's read.
Them to try and maximise their
let's read. I mean, the Germany's finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble said there is no a la carte menu. There is only the whole menu or none. The Dutch finance minister more recently actually said that Boris Johnson, what he's offering to the British people are options that are just not available. So, on the basis of it may be rhetoric, they're not going to do what you say.
Yeah, that's their high opening bid. We will come down to somewhere. Look, I mean, both sides you would expect to make a high opening bid at this stage. You'd expect HMG to do it. You'd expect Eurocrats to do it. We will end up, I'm pretty confident, with something where we are in the free market, but we are outside the political union. And by the way, a lot of the people who are now cutting up nasty,
but that is the common market. You said you wanted to come out of a common market. Then we would still be in it.
So to repeat, there is a pan-European free trade area. You can go from Iceland to Turkey without bumping into any tariffs or trade barriers. I really don't think anyone is seriously proposing that Britain would be the only country, apart from Belarus, the only geographically European country that would face tariffs and trade barriers.
Right, well,
the question is,
this is the first country to actually have a Brexit in that sense
so
to come out. So Donald Tusk, or a weaker one, depending on which way you look at it, Donald Tusk has said the only real alternative to a hard Brexit is no Brexit.
Yes, this is the incredible thing, and it will seem incredible to our readers. I would say 2/3 of people I talk to in Brussels still don't accept the result. They still think that somehow Britain is going to come to its senses. And so if they're sort of hard enough in their rhetoric that we might switch round, and that's just such a bad misreading of our character. When people feel that they're being bullied, it pushes them the other way.
I mean, Cat Smith, currently Theresa May is refusing to guarantee the future residency of the 3 million nationals from other EU countries, partly because of negotiation. She feels she can't say it categorically. Do you think she should guarantee the rights of those people now?
Absolutely. These are people that have lived and worked and contributed and studied and have families here in the UK, and they deserve to have some level of security. I mean, we talked earlier about business. There's a lot of unknowns and insecurity in business, but there's actually a lot of unknowns and insecurities in people's lives. I've been contacted by hundreds of people that are really worried about this in my constituency, which is, you know, it's not the most diverse of constituencies, but we have many European people who are contributing in our universities in particular, who want some stability in their life, and I think they deserve that, and it means that we could then offer that reassurance to many British people who are living in other European countries.
Do you think she should just guarantee that?
I agree with Kat, and so do 84% of British voters.
Right, but she hasn't done it yet in terms of a complete guarantee.
Like I said, high opening bids.
Now, let's talk about some rather unusual goings-on as the Conservatives seek to replace their MEP for Yorkshire and Humberside. The vacancy arose after the last man in the job, Timothy Kirkhope, was given a seat in the Lords by David Cameron in his final honours list. It would normally go to the person who came second in the Conservative list for the region at the 2014 European elections, which in this case is former Olympic rower Alex Storey. But instead, the party has chosen to hand the seat to the man who came third on the list, the Leeds councillor John Proctor. Mr Storey has been attempting to overturn the decision, but last week lost an attempt to block Mr Proctor's appointment in the courts. Well, Alex Storey joins us now. How are you feeling about it all, Alex?
Well, it's been a bit of a shock. You know, historically in the UK we have political representation underpinned by a democratic process. I won the support of the Yorkshire Conservative membership. I was on the ballot box. I campaigned in that capacity as number 2 on the list. I won 127,000 votes. And what happened last week is that the Conservative Party Central Office decided to overturn the ballot results, in effect setting off, in my view, a constitutional issue. They've decided, somebody centrally at Central Office, in this case Gareth Fox, a man who is elected by no one, decided to appoint to an elected seat a person who received neither the support of the Conservative Party membership in Yorkshire nor of the electorate.
Right, well, let me just read to you the statement from the Conservative Party. A spokesman said, following Timothy Kirkhope's departure from the European Parliament, Leeds City Councillor John Proctor has been confirmed, as you say, by the Conservative Party to fill the vacancy. He will be a strong voice for Yorkshire and the Humber as we get on with the job of delivering what the people of the UK voted for in June, leaving the European Union and making a success of Brexit. Why would you want to spend thousands of pounds of your own money for a job that isn't going to exist in a few years' time?
Well, you see, I have campaigned for the Conservative Party for nearly 20 years. My father is a professor of political science at one of the best business schools in the world, INSEAD in Fontainebleau. I've grown up with politics and political economy in my blood. It would have been a huge honour for me, having in particular fought on the Brexit side of the argument, to go to the European Parliament and put a very positive case about our relationship with the European Union.
All right.
As you probably know, I'm half English, half Austrian. I was born in France. My wife is German. I have Italian and Spanish cousins. I love Europe, but I wanted to have the opportunity in the next 2.5 years, possibly the most exciting part of our history with the organisation since the end of the Second World War, to do something positive about it.
All right, Alex. Well, let me do you sympathise, Dan Hannan? Do you think he's been mistreated?
Of course I sympathise. I mean, anyone in that position would be furious,
Sure.
but them's the rules. I mean, and you know, that's the decision has now been made.
What, that he's been leapfrogged by the person who was third on the list?
That's what the court has decided to uphold. I mean, if I were Alex, I'd be pretty sore about it.
Right, OK.
No. Can I just intervene? The court didn't overturn anything. We were trying to stop the nomination of John Proctor because we had been given 30 days and we had a dispute with the Conservative Party and we needed to be able to get a little bit, to have more time in order to go to a judicial evaluation with the party, which they did propose anyway. The injunction for the High Court on the Council was not something that had to do with a vote. It had something to do about delaying the process of nominating John Proctor.
All right.
So the important thing here is a question of democracy.
But are you going to pursue it? Are you going to carry on with legal action?
It's an interesting thing. I mean, the bottom line for me is that having worked so hard for an organisation for so long, I stood for 3 general election and I won the ballot for the membership in 2014. I received 127,000 votes. John Proctor received 0 votes, didn't get the backing of anybody, well, not that many people in the Conservative Party in Yorkshire.
Okay.
And he has been appointed to an elected position.
All right.
So the question is, what will I do? It's very difficult for me to say at the moment.
So you haven't decided?
I haven't decided.
All right.
We have the litigation papers ready to go.
Okay.
We have a very strong case. But the bottom line for me is this. If an organisation can treat its volunteers and its candidates like slave labour and attack them as they have, when really they haven't done anything wrong or they haven't brought the party in disrepute in any particular way, what is the point of that organisation?
All right, well, let us know if you do decide to go ahead with further legal action. Alex Storey, thank you. It's now time to find out the answer to our quiz. And the question, guests, was what appears on the cushions in Donald Trump's New York apartment? Is it A, Hillary Clinton, B, the Trump coat of arms, C, the slogan "You're fired," or D, an embroidered image of the Mexican border? What do you think it is, the two of you?
Well, I've not had an invitation to Trump Towers, but
Not yet.
Not yet. And I think it's the coat of arms.
It's got to be.
I think it has got to be the coat of arms. It would have been nice to think it could have been any of the others.
The others would have been
but I think you're right, the two of you. Well done. And we're joined now by the heraldic consultant, and we're pleased to hear that there is such a job, Rafe Haydel-Mankoo. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Welcome to the programme. So tell us about this coat of arms of Donald Trump. What does it actually represent?
Well, this is rather interesting, actually. This is arcane Scottish heraldic law providing evidence of Donald Trump's deep Anglophilia, I would say, and also touches upon the royal prerogative, another hot topic of today.
It certainly is.
Donald Trump basically in 2008 tried to get government support in Scotland for one of his golf courses, and to do so he put out this Trump coat of arms, which everyone thought was Donald Trump's personal coat of arms, but in fact they were created by 2 people in his staff, and anyone who knows heraldry would see the clear heraldic violations in the rules. So unfortunately Scotland has the most strict heraldic regulations in the world. One of the few countries that regulates it. The Queen delegated, or the monarch delegated royal authority through the prerogative to Lord Lyon, who's a Scottish judge, and Trump was basically forced to abandon this coat of arms rather embarrassingly, and 4 years later the Crown granted a coat of arms, but not to Donald Trump. It went to the golf course.
Right.
So Donald Trump has pillars in Trump Tower, which are basically for an Aberdeen golf course.
Right, well, look, I think we're going to show, we can see it there. Tell us, what does it say about him?
Well, a coat of arms really is a shorthand to history, but so here we have the Scottish line rampant represented at the top in a stylised version, 2 stars beneath it for his American heritage, 3 chevronels, the inverted Vs, for the golf course, representing sea, sand dunes and land. And there we have the double-headed eagle, representing his Scottish Germanic heritage.
Right.
And the eagles are grasping 2 golf balls, which further suggests that perhaps these aren't really Donald's.
How very convenient. And what if my guests here wanted to have their own coat of arms? How difficult is it?
Well, there's a criteria that they be ladies or gentlemen of upstanding quality, and I think there's a fair bit of evidence for that today to see. But anyone who has some professional qualifications or university degree or stands out in their community, has received an honour, can petition for a grant of arms. It's rather expensive, about £5,000 or so in England, 3,000 in Scotland. Good old Scots on that level. And quite a prolonged process, but a wonderful way to preserve your family heritage and history for future generations, because coats of arms in this country are personal property which can't be assumed by other people.
Right, well, let's ask. Any ideas for a motto if you were to have a coat of arms, or what it might look like, Dan?
Oh, it would have to be some quote from the bard. He has a lot to say about heralds and heraldry. You know, they play a big part. Particularly, I like the bit at the end of Henry V, where the herald announces the enormous war dead on the other side.
I think he thought about it. I think he thought about it.
What
about one for you? What about one for you, Karen?
Well, I'm wondering if there are any Smith coats of arms already out there that I could steal.
Can you clone them? On that basis, thank you very much for coming in. That was fascinating history. That's it for today, and thank you to all of our guests, but particularly obviously to you two for being our guests of the day. The 1 o'clock news is starting over shortly on BBC One, and I'll be back tomorrow at noon. Join me then. Bye.